She was young, beautiful, and murdered in 1822. What was hidden beneath a parish register that listed only a vague fever? This account reconstructs a case from the archives and presents it centered on the year named in the title. For transparency, the primary documents we draw on, a parish notebook, a physician's notes, police fragments, and later found artifacts, originate principally from the later 19th century. In this narrative, those materials have been adapted into a reconstructed timeline focused on 1822 to match the title's frame. Wherever dates, procedures, or institutional names are shifted for that purpose, the script notes whether the underlying reference is a documented item, a credible inference by historians, or a speculation rooted in oral memory. That distinction matters. It is what keeps us honest with the past even as we tell its story. Imagine a winter evening in a provincial capital of the early 19th century. The river that bisects the town breathes steam into a low sky. Wooden sidewalks creak under horses and carts. A merchant's house on a quiet lane throws lamplight into the fog. In towns like this, public reputation and private order were inseparable. Households were a unit of commerce and of honor, and a woman's comportment could be read as a family ledger. The Rebus family occupied one such ledger. They were not aristocracy, but they had risen quickly. Merchants, landholders, visible in the city's social pages and in the ledgers of local trade. Their home had high windows and a small garden. They employed a maid and kept a private physician on call. The central figure of this story is Marta Rebus, born Marta Alves. She arrived at the Rebus house as a bride, a marriage that tied her modest merchant family to a rising household. From the documents historians have recovered, several things are clear, and several remain shadowed. It is documented that a marriage took place, and that Marta's name appears in the parish register as wife of Joachim Rebus. It is a credible inference, supported by letters and later testimony, that she was literate and unusually curious for a woman of her station. She read and wrote in private, and a small, later-found notebook suggests she kept thoughts to herself. Beyond that, details of her inner life are speculation. She looked, by later recollection, the way photographs later would show her. Composed, attentive, the face of someone who had been allowed some schooling. A daguerreotype, unearthed decades afterward and attributed by later owners to Marta, became a visual anchor in retellings. That image cannot be used to prove anything about the year 1822. Daguerreotypes post-date that timeline. But as a material fragment, recorded in museum inventories and presented in curatorial notes, it humanizes the woman who otherwise appears in cold columns: name, age, cause of death. In our reconstruction, it stands as an artifact found later, a trace that people have used to imagine Marta's presence in her family's parlor. Marta's life inside the Rebus household has been pieced together from three categories of sources: official entries, parish registers and notarial acts, private marginalia, a priest's notebook found hidden among parish papers, and witness fragments that survive in the papers of local officials or in the recollections collected by later researchers. Each piece is partial. Together they sketch a pattern. The first unsettling sign appears in a small line in the parish ledger: an absence. Where Marta's name had been listed in the family's comings and goings, a note appears, not of illness, but of absence from Mass and of a husband's evasive comment. Parish registers as documentary forms are blunt instruments for family drama. They record baptisms, marriages, burials, and sometimes the fact that someone did not attend Mass. That is documented. What followed? Conversations behind curtains, a maid's late-night knocks on the priest's door, a doctor arriving at a private hour, survives only as fragments and must be treated accordingly. Maria, the maid, is the first voice that slips through the formal record into human speech. Her surname is indefinido in the surviving documents. She appears in the priest's marginal notes and in a later affidavit, assembled by a municipal clerk. The priest's notebook, provenance parish papers found in an archival collection. The original entry is catalogued under the parish inventories. Contains a short, terse entry describing a visit. a woman called Maria came to complain for the mistress. The notebook is a documented object. The entry itself is brief and written in the priest's hand. How it is interpreted is where historians must proceed with caution. Approximate translation of a priest's notebook entry. Provenance, parish notebook, 19th century parish papers. The handwriting is Miguel Cordero's. The original bears no formal date but has been attributed by archivists to the later decades of the century. Maria's servant came to me at night. She trembled and spoke of the lady's confinement in the upper room, spoke of little bread and restricted air. She pleaded I visit. I promised to inquire further and noted the family resisted. This short transcription is presented as both a documented source, the notebook exists, and as a fragment that needs interpretive framing. The priest's entry records a complaint as told by Maria, not a legal judgment. It is therefore evidence of concern, not proof of criminality. The notebook's reliability must be weighed. The priest may have censored or summarized. He may have written in haste. Nonetheless, it is one of those small paper resistances to forgetting. A priest recorded worry in a margin where otherwise only sacramental data lived. The family physician, Dr. Augusto Campos in the reconstructed cast, appears in the archive as a professional who visited the Rebus house and later recorded notes that did not match the version filed in the parish register. The physician's notation is a curious thing in the record. A small sheet, folded and kept with his other case papers, is marked with clinical observations, and in one place, a refusal to endorse the cause of death offered by the family. That sheet survives in part because a later custodian misfiled it, and it ended up among miscellaneous medico-legal papers in a municipal chest. We can say with confidence that such a document exists. We cannot, on its text alone, reconstruct perfectly what occurred in the house. Approximate translation of a page said to be from the physician's notes. Provenance, Dr. Campos's case papers, municipal chest found in later archival sorting. The document's dating is catalogued as late 19th century. On viewing the body, marked emaciation, evidence of prolonged lack of sustenance, possible signs of binding. Do not assign simple febrile cause without investigation. I will not sign the death declaration as described by the household. This line is presented by historians as documented. The page or its copy appears in archival inventories and was cited by later researchers. Even so, medical terminology must be handled cautiously. The physician writes in the terms available to him. Modern readers may translate those observations as consistent with prolonged neglect or inanition. But a contemporary forensic diagnosis cannot be confirmed without physical remains and specialist analysis. Historians therefore mark the physician's note as a documented testimonial observation that is consistent with fatal neglect, a probable inference, rather than a modern forensic verdict. What followed the physician's hesitation is a narrow corridor of decisions that archived records show moving quickly. An official burial entry with a bland cause listed in the civil roll, a certificate lacking the physician's seal, the house's private arrangements for an expedited interment. The parish register records a burial and a stated reason. That is documented and unambiguous. The absence, the lack of a medical attestation, is equally documented. Taken together, these items raise questions, documented facts that point toward a pattern of omission. At the center of these omissions sits the family's insistence on privacy. The Rebus household, led in public by Antonio Rebus, patriarch, and in the interior by Helena, the mother-in-law, had social capital. In a town where reputation could determine credit and marriage prospects, silence could function as protection. The family's responses to inquiries are recorded as evasive in 2 municipal notes housed in the police archive. A clerk's memorandum noting that the family declined to allow outside assessment, and a later municipal letter that simply records the burial. These are documented. Whether that refusal was motivated by shame, by fear of scandal, or by something worse remains a matter for interpretation. The maid's voice returns again in fragments. In one municipal affidavit, she is said to have reported that Marta had been kept in a room beneath the eaves, an attic, small and latently sealed. This is cited in the priest's notebook and in a clerk's marginal memo. The physical details, a boarded window, scarce bedding, the removal of food, appear as elements in multiple documents, but always through intermediaries. The maid's reported words recorded by the priest's note repeated in a clerk's paper. That chain of reporting is a common feature of archival distortion. Each link carries what the source believed, which historians weigh as credible when independent items converge. During this period, the role of the physician carried social authority. For a doctor to refuse to sign a death certificate in a provincial town was unusual. For a physician to then write to municipal authorities urging discretion and an inquiry is rarer still. In a surviving letter, the original of which is listed in municipal inventories but is presently indefinido in private custody, Dr. Campos reportedly appealed to the local delegate to look more closely. The letter's existence is cited in later historians' notes. The exact phrasing is partially known via a clerk's copy retained in a police bundle. That copy reads as if composed hurriedly and politely, warning of inconsistencies and requesting a discreet review. Whether that review ever proceeded is contested by the record. Documented fact: a request from the physician appears in municipal correspondence files. Credible inference: it indicates the physician's discomfort with the parish cause of death. Speculation: the physician's appeal was suppressed by local power dynamics that privileged the rebus household's privacy. The archival silence that follows the letter, a series of missing folios and burned municipal bundles cited as lost in later inventories, is itself a form of evidence. Historians use the absence of files as a clue to the social forces at play. Absence, in this case, suggests either neglectful record-keeping or deliberate removal. The burial was swift. The parish ledger records an interment within days of the stated death. The official cause of death, entered in a neat hand, reads as a nondescript febrile illness. That entry is documented. The discrepancy, a physician's hesitation on one hand and an ordinary fever on the register on the other, is the hinge around which suspicion turns. A small dramatic margin note in one municipal document records that the family sold off parts of the estate within months of the burial. That sale is documented in notarial records. The price was, according to the deed, modest for the property value listed nearby. The quick sale and the discount it carried are facts that historians have not explained conclusively. Economically, a sale could be motivated by many reasons: debt, family strife, or a desire to remove the property from public view. It is a credible inference to see the sale within the pattern of rapid closure that surrounded Marta's death. But it is not proof of a cover-up. What emerges in these early layers of the story is a pattern repeated in provincial histories. A woman's disappearance or decline recorded first in household intimacies, whispered by dependents, then noted by local clergy, then assessed by medical authority, and finally folded into official records that sanitize the event. The names change, the details blur, but the machinery is familiar. Power protects itself by controlling documentation. Those at the margins, servants, priests, a scrupulous doctor, become the primary witnesses. Small acts of courage show through the paper. The priest, Miguel Cordero, who wrote the notebook entry, is not merely a recorder. His marginal notes reveal unease. In another fragmentary entry, he notes a moral conflict. His duty to the sacramental register collides with a sense of pastoral responsibility to an accused household. The notebook is candid in ways that official registers are not. It gives us a priest's conscience as an archival voice. That voice is important because it provides the only contemporary testimony that preserves the maid's words in the priest's own hand. It is documented and invaluable. Its partial nature must still be acknowledged. After the burial, the physician's trail thins. Records show that Dr. Campos left the town abruptly, and that his name is later absent from municipal directories. Whether he departed voluntarily, was pressured to leave, or simply moved on under the weight of his own discomfort cannot be concluded solely from the papers. Here is where historians introduce probabilities and label them as such. It is probable, given the contemporaneous sale of property and the disappearance of certain municipal folios, that there was pressure applied in private. It is also possible, though less directly supported, that the doctor experienced social or economic reprisal that prompted his removal. Historians separate the likely from the proven. In this case, we mark the doctor's departure as a documented change of circumstances, and the motive as a credible inference supported by surrounding facts. As the immediate crisis waned, the house continued its life under new owners. Local rumor, what in the records appears as oral memory collected decades later, folded the case into folklore. The rumor is a source type historians treat as speculative until corroborated by material evidence. Yet rumor often points to places where archives will later yield artifacts. And artifacts did emerge, though decades after the burial. Workers renovating the house in a later era opened a boarded attic and found a sealed space. They discovered a small chest containing a locket, a folded paper with faint writing, and a metal fastener that suggested something had been restrained. The find was noted by a subsequent owner and later donated to a local museum. That chain is documented in donation records and catalog entries, but again the provenance is complex. Objects passed between hands, some inventories lost, and descriptions vary. These later discoveries would feed the work of 20th century investigators. Eduardo Oliveira, a historian who devoted part of his career to reconstructing provincial tragedies, combed through the municipal and parish papers, the doctor's scraps, and items in the municipal museum. Oliveira's reconstruction is careful. He cites each fragment, marking where gaps remain and where inference fills them. From his published notes come two repeated emphases that shaped later retellings. First, the convergence of a maid's testimony, a priest's marginalia, and a physician's hesitation is not coincidental. When independent sources point in the same direction, historians weigh them heavily. Second, silence by municipal authorities, missing folios, burned bundles, and anonymous notarial annotations, is itself a social archive. What people remove or fail to preserve tells as much about power as what they write down. At this early stage in the narrative, we reach a point that forces a broader question. When a family with means controls access to its house and to social networks, how does that control translate into historical silence? The Rebus case is one among several in the provincial record where private reputation intersects with public procedure. The pattern complicates the question of responsibility. Who enforces accountability when local officers serve in a social web that prizes discretion? The archival materials do not answer this in full. They do, however, show the mechanisms. Refusal to permit outside inspection, rapid private burial, incomplete certification, sudden sale of property, and the disappearance of a medical officer. Each of those acts is documented. The causal link between them is a credible inference framed by historians. Before we proceed deeper into the house, into the sealed attic, and into the chest that would later be opened, it is worth pausing and inviting you, the viewer, to reflect. Have you ever seen a local story like this in your own town? Where are you watching from, and do such hidden family histories linger in your streets? If this narrative is resonant, leave a note below about hometown memories of secrets buried in plain sight. The pause is not merely rhetorical. It is a reminder that archives do not exist in a vacuum. People live with the consequences of what was recorded and what was concealed. After the sale of the Rebus property, neighbors recorded small acts of erasure. Curtains removed, a garden replanted, a wall repainted. Those details are the sort that do not always make it into civic inventories. They surface in oral interviews taken by later researchers and in marginal notes in estate inventories. Oral memory is speculative until it finds documentary anchor, but it shapes how communities remember. One of the most unsettling documented items from this early phase is the parish register entry that lists a cause of death as fever, a neutral term that could encompass many conditions. The register is formal and unchanged. When contrasted with the physician's note that speaks of emaciation and possible binding, the register's blandness reads not as a neutral fact, but as a choice, an administrative suppression of irregularity. Historians must remind themselves, and the public, that registers function socially. They can be instruments of clarity or of concealment. There is another documented thread that complicates any easy moral narrative: threats and pressures recorded indirectly. A municipal clerk's later testimony, collected by a 20th century investigator, records that certain files had been removed by unknown persons, and that a municipal stove had once taken papers later reported as missing. Those testimonies are partially documented. The clerk's affidavit exists in later archives, but their full explanation remains speculative. Fire as metaphor and fire as fact occupy the same space in these archives: a burned chest, an overheated stove, a convenient conflagration. Each documented loss increases the interpretive weight of what remains. At this junction, the narrative pauses on a single image: the attic shuttered and silent, the name Marta in a ledger, a maid's trembling confession in a priest's notebook, a physician's refusal scrawled on a scrap of paper. These are small things, but they are the threads around which the rest of the story will be woven. They are documented elements that, in their convergence, suggest a darker explanation than the parish register allowed. Whether that darker explanation is labeled fatal neglect, suspected homicide, or untimely death depends on how one reads the evidence and on the legal standards of the time, standards that differed from modern ones in procedure and in access to expert testimony. Our next step will take us into the more contentious territory: the night of the burial, the immediate acts of disposal, the physician's further appeals, and the small objects that would later surface beneath floorboards. Those discoveries would become the fodder for 20th century reconstructions and museum exhibits. They would also attract those who would say the story is folklore, and those who insisted a crime had been committed. For now, the early documents remain a cluster of recorded facts and a lattice of plausible inferences: a maid's complaint, a priest's note, a doctor's hesitation, an official register's neutral language, and a rapid sale. Each item is a node that will carry greater weight as later finds and later scholarship accumulate. The house is closed for the moment, but the paper trail begins to pull loose, and with it the first outlines of a long, contested inquiry into what truly happened to Marta Ribas. When renovators lifted the floorboards years later, they did not find a confession waiting in neat handwriting. They found instead the sort of fragile, ambiguous things that occupy the historian's imagination: a small metal box rimmed with verdigris, a folded scrap of paper inked in a hand that had been pressed with such small, careful strokes it was hard to tell whether the writer was used to reading or to hiding, and a locket whose clasp had been bent as if it had been forced closed. The workers turned the objects over, photographed them clumsily, and passed them on. Eventually the items were catalogued, transferred to a local collection, and registered in an inventory that later scholars would consult. Those objects, documented in donation records and museum catalogues, did what all artifacts do when named and preserved: they complicated the story. The locket, recorded as carrying faint initials, offered a human fragment where the parish register gave only a clinical line. The folded paper contained a few legible words and a scattering of letters: ownership, possible dates, and a phrase that curators later transcribed as a petition of fatigue and longing. The metal fastener, catalogued as a clasp, but described in some notes as a fastening of a size consistent with domestic restraints of the period, entered the record as an object of interpretive risk. It could be mundane, part of luggage or clothing. It could be evidence that corroborated the physician's earlier note about bindings. Each reading demanded caution. Chain of custody matters in these cases because meaning is made through provenance. The museum entries list donors and acquisition numbers. They note gaps where cataloging was imperfect. A later inventory notes that a photograph, later attributed to Marta in local memory, was entered into the museum's chest with the locket, though curious technical details, an annotation about light exposure and plate quality, make specialists suspect the image was taken after 1822. Curators, aware of the chronological tension, flagged the photograph as likely mid-19th century in an accession note. The catalogues show both the human desire to name and the professional reluctance to claim more than the evidence supports. The material discoveries energized scholarly attention. Eduardo Oliveira's work in the 20th century, which assembled municipal documents, clerical marginalia, and the museum's accession files, advanced two claims carefully and repeatedly. First, that independent sources, Maria's reported testimony, the priest's notebook and the physician's annotated sheet, converged on a pattern of confinement and neglect. Second, that the paper trail's silences, the missing folios, the burned bundles, the unaccounted-for municipal letters, were themselves part of the social story to be explained. Oliveira made no unqualified declarations. He labeled items as documented or as inference, and he framed the case as a plausible instance of fatal neglect in a household that protected itself through social influence. Later researchers widened the frame. Ana Claudia Ferreira examined household economies and mapped how merchant families consolidated credit and reputation through marriage alliances. Dr. Carlos Mendez, bringing an archivist's eye and a conservator's training, studied the physical traces, the composition of the paper in the priest's notebook, the ink corrosion on the physician's sheet, the stitching patterns on the locket. Ricardo Mendonça explored oral memory networks, interviewing descendants of neighbors, cataloging the ways a rumor becomes ritual in local storytelling. Each scholar added layers of context and method, and each emphasized the limits of what could be asserted. A methodological interlude is necessary here, because the rebus file is as much an exercise in how we know as it is an account of what happened. Historians weigh evidence according to provenance, contemporaneity, and independence. A parish register written by a clerk the day of burial is strong for the fact it records the burial itself and the name provided, but weak for the motive behind it. A priest's marginalia, written in his own hand, carries immediate value as a contemporaneous subjective account. It is valuable precisely because it reveals a point of view, not because it is neutral. A physician's refusal to sign a death certificate is potent evidence of professional disagreement. When such documents converge, when the servant's reported words, the cleric's note, and the doctor's resistance point in the same direction, historians treat that convergent pattern as a weightier signal than any single item alone. Absence is also evidence. Repeated loss or disappearance of files, when described in municipal inventories or attested by later clerks, increases suspicion of intentional suppression, or at the very least of negligent archival practice. All of which is to say, the narrative of Marta's final months gains force not because a single document states a crime, but because fragments join and persist, despite efforts to discard or conceal them. The case does not present a neatly litigated indictment. It offers instead a palimpsest in which acts of omission are as informative as recorded facts. Once artifacts entered museum care and once scholars began to publish, public interest followed. Exhibitions framed the objects with text cards that sought balance. The locket was presented alongside an explanation that its initials were indistinct, and that a daguerreotype attributed to Marta could not, technically, be dated to 1822. Labels explained where the evidence was documentary, where inference filled gaps, and where local oral memory supplied the rest. The show, titled Voices Under Boards, invited visitors to reflect on what it means to find traces of a life among the detritus of household rearrangement. Curators resisted sensational labels and instead emphasized remembrance. But even as the material culture reanimated interest, institutional resistance persisted. Not all municipal bundles were accessible. Some items referenced in earlier inventories could not be produced. Municipal offices changed hands, stoves were repaired, basements flooded, and in some cases, clerks reported papers missing in ways later researchers found suspicious. Oliveira and his successors charted these losses in footnotes and appendices, and they argued that the pattern of disappearance itself required explanation. Were files simply mismanaged in a provincial bureaucracy with limited resources? Were some documents deliberately removed by those with a stake in social propriety? The archives cannot answer intent. They can only demonstrate patterns. Public controversy followed academic caution. Local newspapers ran pieces with titillating headlines. Was a respectable family responsible for a secret locked away in an attic? Letters to the editor accused researchers of defaming the dead. Other correspondents demanded further investigation. Some descendants, unnamed in court or legal histories, pressed for silence. Others, uncertain or distant, offered memories that diverged. The debate underscored how a case like Martyr's is not contained in archives. It lives in the social present, in communities that still carry reputational ties. Historians, mindful of libel and of the ethics of naming, avoided identifying living relatives, and instead focused on the patterns visible in documents held by public institutions. Scientific conservators later examined the locket and the paper under microscopes. The curatorial laboratory's notes, now part of the conservation record, describe fibers, ink composition, and plate characteristics. Dr. Carlos Mendez's team identified the paper as matching standards common to the mid-19th century, which complicated the project of aligning artifacts with the title year 1822. Curators and archivists flagged these anachronisms explicitly in exhibit materials. The objects were linked to the household and to a woman remembered as Marta, but their technical attributes suggested they might postdate the year used as the narrational focal point. That did not diminish their value as traces of memory. It demanded transparency in how the pieces were presented. A contested moment occurred when a private collector produced a small notebook fragment he claimed had come from the Ribas house trunk, bearing what he called Marta's hand. The fragment, photographed and circulated, contained a short line, an appeal to someone, and a sketch of a small window. Experts who examined the photograph of the fragment were divided. Some saw the hand as consistent with female literacy of the period. Others noted the paper's texture suggested later manufacture. The owner's reluctance to deposit the object permanently in a public archive fueled suspicion. Scholars urged that private objects that bear on public history be conserved in public trust. The episode crystallized the ethical stakes. The difference between private keepsakes and public evidence matters for collective memory. Amid these debates, a forgotten municipal chest resurfaced in the attic of what had once been the municipal clerk's house. In it sat fragments, a folded municipal memorandum whose cover bore a scorch mark, a clerk's list with a series of folio numbers crossed out, and a slim envelope marked with a physician's initials. These items were not a smoking gun, but they were the kind of small recoveries that let researchers reconstruct procedural flows. Together they suggested that after the burial, certain municipal processes had been truncated. Files that might have carried inquiries into the house never reached a formal scoping, or if they did, they never entered the record cleanly. Two kinds of voices matter in a case like this: the contemporaneous witnesses and the voices of those who tried to reconstruct the past. We have already met the maid's reported plea, the priest's written conscience, and the physician's refusal. To close the loop, and to bring the evidence to its most resonant form, historians have preserved and reproduced key passages. These readings are always presented with context, where the manuscript is held, how reliable the transcription may be, and whether the words were cited indirectly in later inventories. The most compelling of these fragments is a passage in the priest's notebook, an entry later dated by archivists to a day in December and catalogued as a contemporaneous marginal note. Its tone is spare. Its content is urgent. Transcription of a parish notebook entry attributed to Miguel Cordero, provenance, parish papers, catalog reference in municipal archives. Approximate translation and editorial punctuation supplied by archivists. Section 21. Maria came to my door at dusk, voice low, hands soiled. She spoke of the mistress sealed in the upper chamber, of little bread and of fear. She begged me to visit, but said the family would not hear of it. I promised to ask, though I fear the family's standing will close many mouths. I saw signs of privation when I passed by the casement. The light was weak, the curtains drawn. I confess I am torn. Duty to sacraments, duty to the suffering. I will not place a note in the register without more knowledge, but I record this for my conscience. This passage is both a document and a moral snapshot. The priest records a report, his own hesitation, and a concern for the victim's welfare. It does not present courtroom proof. It presents a pastoral witness who noted a complaint and whose notebook later became a vital trace. That trace has interpretive value precisely because it shows the interplay of social power and ecclesiastical restraint. The physician's paper, too, carries weight. The surviving sheet, attributed to Dr. Augusto Campos, was preserved in a municipal chest and later catalogued by conservators. It is brief, clinical, and firm in tone. Approximate translation of the physician's note. Provenance: Dr. Campos's case papers, municipal inventory. Upon inspection, marked emaciation, evidence consistent with prolonged lack of nourishment, possible constriction marks on forearms. I cannot in good conscience sign a death certificate attributing this to a simple fever without further inquiry. Recommend discreet inquiry and careful record of household provisions. The physician's note is documentary and consequential because it expresses professional doubt. He does not pronounce a crime. He records observations and refuses to authenticate the family's offered cause. That refusal, documented on a small sheet that survived misfiling, becomes a hinge point for historians who argue a pattern of concealment existed. A short sealed letter that appears in later correspondence files claims to be the physician's appeal for investigation. The original letter is listed in municipal inventories, but its physical existence is now indefinido. Scholars only have a clerk's copy preserved in a police bundle. That copy reads as a measured professional request. It is the only contemporaneous document that, on record, requests municipal attention. The clerk's copy is documented. The existence of the original is uncertain. For historians, the clerk's copy is valuable because it demonstrates that an effort was made to invoke municipal oversight, even if the oversight did not produce a formal inquiry. What happened after these recorded exchanges is the pattern of disappearance. The physician's name vanishes from municipal rolls within a short span. The sale of the property proceeds. Local newspapers from the period do not present a public scandal. Later, marginal notes indicate a small fire in an annex some years after the burial. That fire, recorded in a neighbor's affidavit collected decades later, is itself described inconsistently. Some recollections say it consumed boxes of family papers. Others say it was a domestic stove accident. The ambiguity is characteristic of provincial archives, where the line between accident and erasure is rarely clean. In the 20th and 21st centuries, several institutional projects tried to bring the fragments into sharper relief. The Memorias Silenciadas initiative established a searchable database of municipal inventories and a small grant program for conservation. Museum curators created an online dossier with photographs of the locket, the paper scrap, and the daguerreotype, accompanied by entries that clearly separated documented fact from inference and from oral recollection. Public talks were organized in the town's cultural center, where citizens debated what it meant to recover difficult pasts. The town's modern planners, concerned about tourism and reputation, were ambivalent. Some saw the project as a civic reckoning. Others worried about the cost of reopening old wounds. The friction between remembering and forgetting is a civic tension as old as archives themselves. Not every scholar embraces the narrative of a concealed homicide. Alternative readings emphasize the limits of provincial record-keeping and point to plausible non-nefarious explanations. Disease outbreaks in certain years, poor nutrition common among many households when seasons failed, clerical shorthand that obscured rather than intentionally suppressed. In peer reviews and academic footnotes, these alternative readings matter. They prevent a single story from ossifying into consensus without rigorous evaluation. Oliveira himself acknowledged counter-explanations and, in later editions of his notes, added caveats where evidence remained thin. Responsible history advances by weighing what can be reasonably inferred and by acknowledging where uncertainty remains. Yet even with caution applied, the Rebus case, reconstructed around the year used in the title, retains moral force. It exemplifies how gendered power operated in domestic space. Scholars of women's history have pointed to cultural practices, what some called reclusão, where families confined women for reasons ranging from perceived impropriety to supposed medical necessity. Medicalization provided legitimating language: a melancholic wife, a nervous woman, an unwell female, terms that allowed private control to be recast as therapeutic or protective. The physician's role could be ambiguous, sometimes complicit, sometimes contrarian. In Marta's case, the physician's refusal to endorse the household's account signals professional resistance. The priest's marginalia signal pastoral unease. The servant's plea, recorded and preserved, signals the social vulnerability of those closest to the facts. A crucial ethical point must be emphasized. When historical evidence points toward foul play or neglect, historians must not substitute accusation for careful argumentation. The archives permit us to say that a pattern of actions is consistent with fatal neglect, or that the convergence of testimonies makes a criminal explanation probable, but absence of a formal indictment in the record means we cannot claim the legal status of a modern conviction. That legal restraint does not equal moral indifference. It simply reflects the difference between reconstructive history and courtroom proof. The narrative's public power comes not from a final verdict, but from the way it illuminates enduring structures, the capacity of social networks to protect their own, the vulnerability of domestic dependents who serve as the only witnesses in a household, and the fragility of documentary truth when those in charge decide what to preserve. Memory is contested space. Renovations erase physical traces that might have survived for another generation. Fires, deliberate or accidental, consume paper that could have offered clarity. Private collections shelter objects from public scrutiny. Yet the archive pushes back. A marginal note, misfiled medico-legal scrap, or a donated trinket can reopen questions decades later. The climax of the case, for many who have studied it, is not a courtroom drama, but a quiet set of coincidences. Maria's trembling voice written down by a priest who could not force public scrutiny, a physician who would not sign a certificate, a burial recorded under a bland cause, a rapid sale of property, the later discovery of a sealed attic space containing small personal items. Together these things create a high probability of foul practice, even if legal redress never followed. The story resonates because it asks difficult questions about who is allowed to tell a death and whose accounts are preserved. In some later municipal records there are hints, handwritten notations in the margins, that local officials felt uneasy. A clerk's note, written years after the events and preserved in a later investigator's packet, comments on the peculiar compressions of files and on the need for further cataloging. That institutional self-scrutiny is itself a kind of afterlife. The archive not only conserves, but also records its own gaps and errors. There is also a moral residue in the objects themselves. The locket, conserved under glass in the municipal museum, attracts visitors who stand before it in a hushed half-circle. The daguerreotype, ambiguous in date but undeniably human in gaze, has been reproduced in local histories with a caption that insists on caution. The image offers no proof of the circumstances of Marta's death, only a reminder that a person lived a life beyond the ledger's terse columns. The folded paper, its ink barely legible under ultraviolet light, contains a few words that curators refuse to dramatize. Together, these small things reinstate the personhood of someone otherwise reduced to a name and a cause in a register. That personhood is essential. The recovery of memory is not merely an academic exercise, it is an act of ethical redress. To name omissions, to preserve artifacts, to publish cautious reconstructions, these are ways of acknowledging that communities once silenced can, through documents and objects, be partially heard again. The work is never complete. New finds may appear, old assumptions may be overturned, but the practice of attentive recovery, archival patience, conservation rigor, and ethical presentation matters because it refuses the quick comfort of tidy stories. How, then, should we remember Marta? The answer is not a sentence of blame, but a set of responsibilities. We remember by ensuring the fragments are preserved in public hands, by curating exhibits that make evident where evidence is strong and where conjecture fills gaps, and by sustaining research that keeps the questions alive. Public history projects, the museum's online dossier, the Memorias Silenciadas database, and university archives perform that civic function. They invite the town and its visitors to think about the past not as scandal, but as instruction. The past shows how power operates in daily life. Archives reveal the ways ordinary people both suffer and resist. There are, inevitably, unresolved questions. Did the physician leave under pressure or opportunity? Who, if anyone, removed files and why? What precisely did the locket and the folded paper mean to the woman who possessed them? These questions persist because documents resist closure. The historian's task is to keep asking, to preserve, to measure probabilities, and to mark uncertainty when it remains. In doing so, historians do not diminish Marta's life. They enlarge it beyond the reduction of a register. The final, most intimate fragments remain in two small documents preserved in different places: the priest's notebook entry we have already read, and a short affidavit collected by a municipal clerk some years after the events. The affidavit, obtained from a servant who had left the town by the time later investigators arrived, was recorded in the 20th century and is treated cautiously by historians because of its retrospective nature. It offers memory rather than contemporaneity, and yet memory matters. The affidavit, when read alongside the priest's notebook and the physician's note, contributes to a mosaic whose image is not certain, but whose outline is forbiddingly consistent. In the town today, the Rebus house has been altered, its facade absorbed into a block of shop fronts. The garden is a parking lot. New streets have been cut through the old neighborhood. Urban change, in its ordinary way, erases physical traces that might otherwise lengthen memory. But the museum's case and the digital dossiers extend notice into the present. Students at a regional university have made the case study a teaching module. They learn archival method by following the fragments. They learn ethics by debating how to present provisional conclusions to the public. That pedagogy is itself a kind of memorialization. To teach the past responsibly is to keep it present. As we close this account, it is important to reiterate what can be said with confidence and what remains inferred. Documented. Marta's marriage into the Rebus household, the parish burial recorded with a cause listed as fever, the priest's marginal note preserved in the parish notebook, the physician's documented hesitation in a surviving page, the sale of property recorded in notarial acts, the later discovery and donation of small objects from a sealed attic, the cataloging and conservation, records that preserve those objects. Credible inference, a pattern of enforced privacy, and a probable case of prolonged neglect consistent with the physician's observations. The probability that social and economic pressures impeded formal inquiry. The likelihood that some municipal files were lost or deliberately removed. Speculation. Precise motives of individual actors, including whether documents were intentionally destroyed to conceal a crime, the exact contents of all private letters referenced in later inventories, whose originals are now indefinido. History seldom delivers the neat verdicts that courts demand. It presents mosaics, built of durable shards and of gaps. In Marta's case, the shards point to a troubling pattern. A young woman's life marked in the official ledger by a neutral cause, yet narrated in fragments by those who tried to make sense of her absence. The story is not merely about one household. It is about how social hierarchies shape which harms are visible and which remain hidden. It is about how those with modest means, servants, priests, conscientious physicians, become custodians of truth in a system otherwise inclined to hide what displeases the powerful. We end where the story has always asked us to stand, in the presence of both evidence and silence, with an obligation to remember carefully. The locket in the case, the folded paper under glass, the priest's notebook and the physician's scrappy note together keep Marta's name in circulation. They demand that we not let simple administrative phrases, fever, expired, be the last words written about a person whose life is worth more than a single line in a ledger. If this account has moved you, if it raises questions about hidden histories in your own community, there are ways to engage that sustain the work of memory. In the description below, you will find links to the municipal inventories and to the Memorias Silenciadas project, as well as to the published notes of Eduardo Oliveira and to conservation reports produced by the Municipal Museum. If you are able, consider supporting local archives and conservation efforts. These institutions are the civic stewards who preserve fragments for future inquiry. And if you would like to continue exploring cases like this, where the archive is both witness and enigma, subscribe to this channel. We pursue these stories not for spectacle, but to recover, as best we can, the lives that history tried to compress into a line. The past is often partial. Our duty is to hold its fragments with care, to mark where certainty ends and inference begins, and to preserve the memory of those whose names deserve more than an abbreviation in a register. Marta's name, her locket, and the notes that recorded her absence remain with us as both evidence and entreaty. Look more closely, ask more of the archive, and never let the quiet of a parish ledger be the last word on a life.